So I'd like to start tonight by introducing our club, the Gonzaga College Republicans, which has organized this event and raised 100% of the funding necessary to bring in tonight's exceptional speaker. Over the past few years, the Gonzaga College Republicans have been dedicated to bringing exceptional speakers with views and perspectives that are rarely heard on this campus, whether it be in classrooms or at other campus events. The outstanding speakers we have brought to Gonzaga include author, filmmaker, and former university president Dinesh D'Souza, Iraqi war veteran and former Congressman Lieutenant Colonel Allen West, and noted scholar and author Christina Hoff Sommers. Each of these events were open to everyone, each was completely free to attend, and each was completely sold out. By any measure, these events were a tremendous success. Despite this level of effort and commitment by a student-led group, we continue to face tremendous opposition from some student and faculty groups. In fact, last spring, after we brought one of our speakers, some of us from the College Republicans attended an event hosted by some faculty who were unhappy about our speakers. They made it clear they did not like what our speaker had to say, nor did they agree in any way with any of our speaker's viewpoints. Ironically, that is exactly how conservative students feel every day in classrooms and at nearly every university-funded event on this campus. To be clear, we have no problem, none at all, with people disagreeing with the viewpoints of the speakers that we have brought to campus. We should all want and encourage open debate and different viewpoints at a university of higher learning. Now, at that meeting with the faculty and students, we expressed what our main goal is, and will continue to be, which is bringing diversity to campus. I'm not referring to diversity in the sense that our speakers included a woman, an African American, and an immigrant from India. What we have strived to do is bring intellectual diversity to Gonzaga. On an almost daily basis, diversity is espoused and celebrated by our administration. What we would like to see is not only diversity of race, religion, and gender, but also a serious commitment by Gonzaga to encouraging and welcoming diversity of thought. We have tried to do that on our own by bringing in serious speakers of national notoriety and significant accomplishment. So, at that meeting with those select faculty members, one of the professors told us, and I quote, "It's hard to take you seriously when you do not bring in serious speakers." Of course, we found that to be an incredibly inaccurate and prejudicial comment, but regardless, I hope that professor is here tonight so they can let us know if Mr. Forbes is serious enough for them. In this spirit of diversity of thought and open dialogue and debate, following the lecture we will have an open question and answer period, not one that is scripted or where the questions are pre-screened. With that, I would like to hand it over to Nick Gervasini, the current president of the Gonzaga College Republicans, to introduce our guest for the evening.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight. I would like to thank Young America's Foundation and several generous donors for completely underwriting our speaker this evening. I would also like to thank the members of the College Republicans for their volunteer work, the administration for the use of this wonderful facility, the staff here at the Hemmingson Center, and our campus security team for their assistance today and over the past few weeks. Over the last few years, the College Republicans have hosted several lectures, all primarily focused on the social issues we face in our world today. But this is the first time we have brought in someone to discuss the importance of our country's economic policy. So when we asked the question, who would be the most qualified speaker to talk on freedom, limited government, and the power of free markets, the name Steve Forbes immediately came to mind. Mr. Forbes is chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media. Forbes magazine, their cornerstone publication, is the leading business magazine in the country. And Forbes.com has become one of the most influential business websites in the world. Mr. Forbes writes editorials under the heading Fact and Comment, and is the only writer to have won the Crystal Owl Award on 4 occasions, a prize formerly given to the financial analyst with the most accurate economic forecast for the year. In 1996 and 2000, Mr. Forbes campaigned vigorously for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Key to his platform were a flat tax, a new Social Security system, term limits, and a strong national defense. In 1985, Mr. Forbes was named chairman of the Board for International Broadcasting, or BIB, by President Ronald Reagan. As chairman of the BIB, Mr. Forbes supervised the operations of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were both acclaimed as critical to the fight against communism. He was reappointed under President George H.W. Bush. He has written numerous books. Among them are How Capitalism Will Save Us, Why Free People and Free Markets Are the Best Answer in Today's Economy, Flat Tax Revolution, Using a Postcard to Abolish the IRS, and Freedom Manifesto, Why Free Markets Are Moral and Big Government Isn't. With that, please give a warm welcome to our guest for the evening, Mr. Steve Forbes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you, Ben, for those courageous words about true diversity. And whatever I say tonight, if you've had dinner, I hope I don't give you indigestion. But it is a great honor to be here, and I want to thank Gonzaga College Republicans for making this possible and for doing so in the face of an environment that is not always hospitable. It's nice to talk about courage, diversity, and the like, quite another to practice it on a day-to-day basis. So thank you guys very, very much. So before I get to what's happening to our economy, our politics, the economics, I'd like to say a few words about free markets, capitalism, free enterprise, whatever way you want to describe it. And this, you lead with it with a very basic question. I'll also get to the stock market. I know I'm going to get that in the Q&A, given the turmoil. And I should should say in advance, an advance warning or full disclosure, share with you a favorite saying of my grandfather, who founded our company about almost a little over 100 years ago. We celebrated Forbes' 100th anniversary in September, and had to unsuccessfully try to make my 2-year-old grandson understand it was the magazine that was 100, not his grandfather. But you know, to youngsters, anyone over the age of 30, we all look the same. But my grandfather came to this country. He was an immigrant, came here a little past the turn of the last century. He was one of 10 children, grade school education. But like millions who came to this country, he had dreams and ambitions and an opportunity to realize those goals. But when asked, after he started Forbes magazine, when asked what was going to happen to the economy, what stocks should you buy, where interest rates were going to go, my grandfather, being an honest individual, would always reply, "You make more money selling the advice than following it." So just keep that in mind. If there are any brokers here, I apologize. But to lead off in terms of understanding how you move ahead and make progress in the world, this certainly is relevant here. You have to ask a basic question that people like Tom Sowell ask, and that is, what is the difference between us today and people of the Stone Age? Same human beings, same appetites, same planet, same resources. The basic difference between us and them is we know more. We have more knowledge. And what that means is even if you have devastating physical destruction, whether natural or human-made, wars and the like, if knowledge is not destroyed and you have an environment where knowledge can be preserved and enhanced, you'll recover and move forward. That's the basic difference. And you see it all the time. You take World War II, immense physical devastation, tens of millions of people killed, and experts thought it would be perhaps a couple of generations before Europe and Japan could overcome the damage of the war. Yet with the U.S. security umbrella, within a handful of years, Western Europe and Japan exceeded pre-war levels of production. Why? Because knowledge was not destroyed. Ben is wearing a pin with the American flag and the Israeli flag. He was in Israel playing golf, sort of beat them, although they didn't fully acknowledge it. not being a good guest, but anyway, that's another subject. But you take the state of Israel, the modern state was founded in 1948. And Israel, as you know, is in the desert. And rainfall during recent years has declined. You'd think they'd have a real water problem. They don't. So you go to Israel today and no real water problem, unlike California, which had a devastating drought for several years. And when they recovered from it, they didn't even have the reservoirs to preserve the water that fell. But you look at the state of Israel in the middle of the desert. How did they do it? Well, part of it was through good technology. Their shower heads, for example, have the same pressure that ours do, but use 1/3 of the water. In agriculture, they're very, very advanced in drip technology. They just don't throw the water everywhere. Very, very precisely laid. And desalination plants. They have several of them. And so as a result of all of this, you take Israel 1948 and today the Israeli population is 10 times what it was in 1948. Agricultural production 16 times what it was in 1948. Industrial production 50 times the size it was in 1948. And yet their net use of water, not per person, but their net use of water today is 10% less than it was in 1948, 70 years ago. That's what knowledge can do. But knowledge has to have a hospitable environment. I mentioned California. And in California, they finally got one desalination plant going. It cost 3 to 4 times what the Israelis do. They did theirs in 15 years. The Israelis do theirs in 3 or 4 years. And the capacity of this plant is about 1/2 of what you would find in an Israeli plant. That is not natural forces. That is just political stupidity and unnecessary blockages of getting basic stuff done. And knowledge not only has to be preserved, but you have to have an environment where you can move ahead. And how do you get knowledge? Through experimentation. Whether it's in the laboratory, in the marketplace, wherever. You have to learn what works and what doesn't work. Constant experimentation. And that means, as George Gilder points out, you have to have power for knowledge. Because if you don't have the power to pursue knowledge, it can get quashed. Classic example was China. Back in the late 1400s, early 1500s, their ability to sail, their ability to make ships was as good or better than those of the Europeans. A couple of times they did voyages to many places around the world, but the regime in Beijing, or China, decided that they didn't like this sort of thing. They destroyed the ships and told the sailors if they ever left and did that again, they'd be put to death if they returned home. So as a result, China stagnated to its huge detriment in the 1800s and 1900s, and we're still paying the price for what happened there when they fell far, far behind right to today, the psychological scars of that. So you have to have the right environment. So in terms of free markets always, if allowed to work, will turn scarcity into abundance. Take, for example, automobiles. 110 years ago, 120 years ago, the auto was a toy for the rich. It cost the equivalent today of over $120,000. Then along comes Henry Ford, a gifted set of engineers creating the moving assembly line, and they turn a toy for the rich into something every working person could afford. You take today your smartphones, handhelds, cell phones, whatever you call it. First one came out of Motorola 35 years ago. It was as big as a shoebox, weighed like a brick, and had a battery life of about 45 minutes. The first one cost $3,995. Even an Apple 10 or Apple 20 or whatever they're on to now, that doesn't cost anywhere near $3,995, and these devices have gone way beyond voice. They do everything now except perhaps grow hair. Maybe they'll do that on the Apple 11 or 12. And think of what an extraordinary thing this whole thing is. If you'd said 20 years ago your grandmother could operate a supercomputer, you would have been looked at as a lunatic. You know, they were almost the size of this room. But thanks to the pursuit of knowledge and technology, everyone with that handheld literally has the world at their fingertips. And it's amazing how spoiled we get with this kind of thing. If you place a call to Outer Mongolia, if it takes more than 6 seconds, you say, what a piece of crap this device is, taking so long. And so scarcity into abundance. Billions of these cell phones, smartphones, whatever you want to call them around the world. You see the widescreen TVs, which are everywhere now. 15 years ago, they cost $12,000 to $20,000. Now they're a few $100. So scarcity into abundance. And a little later I'll talk about health care, where if we do some things right, we can turn scarcity into abundance, not have the horrors of what you're finding in Britain and elsewhere, where they ration health care and bureaucrats determine who lives and who dies. Don't need that here. Another thing, this gets to economists, I wish they would stop defining economics as the allocation of scarce resources. That does not get the heart bumping. Not very exciting, allocation of scarce resources. Really, it's about the creation of resources. Even natural resources are human ingenuity. Take oil. They call it a natural resource. There's nothing natural about it. In and of itself, it's just gooey stuff. It's glop. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't feed it to animals. It's just this gooey stuff. What turned this glop into something the modern world can't live without was human ingenuity. Human ingenuity. Take the age we're in, symbolized by the microchip. Silicon, fancy word for sand. Who knew when you're a kid on the beach? Never going to run out of sand in this world. And who knew those grains would be the basis for literally having a supercomputer in the world at your fingertips. So it's amazing about creating resources. Another thing, we're now getting a lot of scare stories these days about robots. Robots are going to take over the world, and this goes back when you get technology developed. There are always scare stories. Most notable one was Frankenstein. So there's nothing new about, we're going to lose it all to these creatures that we're creating. The answer is really, if you think about it, whether you call them robots or labor-saving devices or whatever name you want to give to it, they've been here from time immemorial, from the wheel. Instead of carrying stuff, wheels would make it a little easier. If you go online, look up a picture of these old washer boards that your great-grandparents washing clothes. You had to wrecked your hands just rubbing this thing against a washer board to get the dirt out. Well, robots came along, and now robots do it. Because these robots don't look like robots, we don't realize what they are. We call them washing machines. Very easy, just throw the stuff in. Don't wreck your hands anymore. Do it in a matter of a few hours or so, and boom, you're done. And instead of slaving over a washer board. So, and one of the biggest robots happened in agriculture. We called it the tractor. Before the tractor, you had to devote, in this country around the world, literally millions of acres to grow forage for farm animals, to move the implements, do the farm work. With the advent of the tractor, all these millions of acres could be freed up to either grow more food or develop or whatever. So this kind of thing has been going on for time immemorial. It's not to be feared. Robots are only as good as their creators. And I don't care how elaborate they are, they're not going to be creative like human beings. So, in terms of when you say commerce and you say philanthropy, business philanthropy, the tendency is to think they're polar opposites. Commerce on one side, philanthropy on the other. And commerce is always getting a bad rap. It's always seen as less elevated than, say, painting a picture or writing a poem. May deliver the physical goods, deliver the stuff, but seen as sort of amoral. The rich get richer, profits before people, markets are cold and inhuman, crushes people. And in Hollywood, research has shown in Hollywood that in Hollywood movies, businessmen, they usually don't have businesswomen in these roles, it's businessmen, kill more people than serial killers do. And the stereotype is either they're obesely fat, with jowls going up and down in glee as they figure out how to poison water and pollute the air and blow up mountains and things like that, or they're spindly thin, crackling their fingers as they take joy in how to murder your household pets and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, even if you're that cliche, even if you're that stereotype, you lust for money, the fact is, in a true free market, you don't get it unless you provide something that somebody else wants. This is where you get the basis of commerce. You don't succeed unless you provide something that somebody else wants. So you may get the money, but somebody else gets something that they want. And so sometimes you don't know what you want. Steve Jobs, when famously asked, do you do marketing surveys? Steve Jobs said, no, because people don't know what they want until I show them. Not a guy who lacked for self-esteem, but that's what entrepreneurship is about. You put something out there, you have no idea, you may think you've done all the smart surveys and everything, but you don't know. You don't know if people are going to take to it or not. Mentioning Apple. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, the company came out with a product called the Newton handheld device. The people who created it had IQs that could boil water, but the thing flopped in the marketplace, failed. But even in failure, you learn. They developed a technology that provided the basis for the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone. So even in failure, you learn what works, what doesn't work, and can provide a foundation for doing successful things in the future. Another thing is about humanity. We're always told that these markets are inhuman. But think of it. Even if you don't love your neighbor, you sure want to sell to your neighbor. It has you reaching out to people you wouldn't normally reach out to in order to succeed. And so also it brings about cooperation, not in the handheld sense, but all of these networks of cooperation to make things happen. Just take a restaurant. Some of you are going to go to a restaurant tonight, get food. Well, think of what goes into a restaurant. Multitudinous things. The restaurateur assumes farmers are going to grow the food. Somebody's going to help process the food. The truckers are going to deliver the food. Somebody's going to deliver the electricity, the water. You have to get somebody's going to make the utensils, the napkins, the stoves, refrigerators, tables, chairs, everything that goes into it. Immense, what we now call supply chains, even the simplest things. So it brings about cooperation because no one's in charge. People are just focused on their own thing. It works because it's meeting the needs and wants of other people. Now we tend to think in this day and age that when you want to do something, you want to get the best people possible. You say, well, what's so profound about that? But that is fairly new in human affairs. Until modern times, you would never trust anyone outside of your immediate family or your ethnic group or your town or your tribe. But the idea of bringing in people from diverse backgrounds to get something done, we think, yeah, of course you do. You want to succeed. But even in places around the world, you still see a very strong family orientation where they just don't really trust anyone outside of an immediate circle. But commerce, free, breaks those barriers down without us even realizing it. Also, creativity allows people from the most unlikely backgrounds to do great things. Sometimes it's not automatic. I mentioned Steve Jobs. If you take, by the way, this gets to the complexity and the amazing thing about human beings. If you took Steve Jobs and took the name away and gave his characteristics and described his personality to somebody in human resources, they would flee in horror. They would throw it away. Just the kind of person you wouldn't want. He was manipulative. He could be nasty, steal people's ideas, put people down, all the kinds of things you wouldn't want, which is why he got fired from his own company before the age of 30. They threw him out. They couldn't stand him, couldn't work with people. And he learned painfully over the next dozen or so years how to be a leader, how you make things work, how you bring talented people together and bring them together. He wasn't a natural-born leader. He had great talent, but he was his own worst enemy. But despite this terrible personality, terrible things he used to do, he learned painfully how to be one of the great leaders in business. So you don't arrive fully formed. You take somebody no one's heard of today, A.P. Giannini. Giannini came from an immigrant family in San Francisco. He was originally in the fruit business with his stepfather, went eventually on a bank board, and he said, why don't we serve this growing immigrant community that was coming into the United States at the time? Immigration is nothing new in this country. And the bank said, and working people, why don't we go out and do more with working people? It was just fairly well-to-do clients the banks in those days had. And the bank said, are you out of your mind? These people, we don't know anything about them. So Giannini left the bank, started his own bank, originally called the Bank of Italy, and he served working people, lent on character, worked with immigrants, and grew the bank, developed California. He did consumer lending, mortgages, ways that the banks wouldn't do. Eventually he bought a bank in LA called Bank of America, adopted the name for his bank, and created the largest bank in the world, serving working people, and doing so successfully. And by the way, even though he was enormously successful, he never paid himself more than $50,000 a year. Even though $50,000 then was a huge sum of money, nothing like what a CEO would get paid today. And when he retired in the late 1940s, his grateful board gave him a $1.5 million bonus. He took the check, gave it to a foundation for medical research. He said, if you have a fortune, it controls you more than you control the fortune. So he ended up, at the end of his life, being out a net worth less than what he did when he began, even though he was enormously successful. But most unlikely background. And sometimes it's people working together as partners, not just in marriage. And these partnerships were often pretty stormy, but sometimes people working together can get things done. You saw it with Apple, with Wozniak and Jobs. You saw it with Google, with Brin and Page. You saw it with Ford. Henry Ford and a guy named James Couzens. Nobody remembers him today. And what an unlikely pairing they were. Henry Ford couldn't run anything. He couldn't have run a corner grocery store. He was so incompetent as an executive. Couzens couldn't make anything. He was all thumbs. If you gave him a model to make, he couldn't do it. Yet this unlikely pair together created the greatest then industrial company in the world, revolutionized transportation. Created this moving assembly line. Most unlikely pairing. They didn't like each other. Ford eventually pushed Couzens out to his detriment, nearly destroyed the company when he couldn't keep good people. But unlikely partnership. By the way, Couzens, just as a little aside, was a fierce man. And when he left Ford, he went into politics, became a senator, U.S. senator from Michigan, and he went after the IRS, then called the Internal Revenue Bureau. And after a Senate hearing, the head of the IRS gave him a subpoena. Said, we're going to get you. Said, you owe us $10 million because you didn't treat your gain from the Ford sale right. Couzens fought them, and several years later, they finally settled. Remember, the IRS asked for $10 million. When the settlement came, the IRS owed Couzens $1 million. This guy was a fighter. Just one other thing on Couzens. And back in those days, there was a big divide between Catholics and Protestants. It was a real big thing. So Couzens decided he got engaged to a Catholic. His family was, oh, you can't do this. So naturally he married the girl and then made clear to his family that all the kids, he had 5 of them, were going to be raised as Catholics. So this guy didn't take anything. So all this doesn't mean free markets are perfect, because people are not perfect. And oftentimes the criticisms of free markets are criticisms of the underside of human beings. And so any system any arrangement involving people is going to have shortcomings. James Madison, the father of our Constitution, was right when he said that if men were angels, we would not need laws, we'd not need government. Well, manifestly, we're not angels, except for maybe some of us with grandchildren, but they only to a certain age. And so you do need laws, but you need sensible laws. So it's one thing to say you don't drive when you're drunk, quite another to tell you what to drive, where to drive, and when to drive. There's a difference. But organizations, finally concluding on this, one of the things about human nature is that organizations involving human beings always become inward-looking, always forget what their original purpose was. You see it happen all the time. In free markets, thankfully, if you do that, you eventually go out of business. because you're not serving your customers. But a good example of this was a British historian, a fellow named C. Northcote Parkinson. What a wonderful name, C. Northcote Parkinson. You know, rolls off the tongue. If you ever change your name, think of something like that. Very, very C. Northcote Parkinson. Whoa, this guy must be something. And then if you adopt a fake British accent, that'll even make it better. And but anyway, back in the 50s, Parkinson was writing a history of the British Navy. And he noticed after World War I, when people at that time, 100 years ago, thought we weren't going to have any more wars again, after what they called the Great War then, that we now call it the First World War. And so Britain at the time had the largest navy in the world. So after the war, the British sharply downsized the Navy, mothballed ships, laid off dock workers, discharged sailors. But Parkinson noticed that as the Navy got smaller, the government agency running the Navy got bigger. And so he concluded that the size of an organization often has nothing to do with the amount of work it's actually supposed to do. It's human nature. And so if you're not in business, if you're with an organization, always try to remind yourself, what is it we are trying to do? Don't become inward looking. Remember your original purpose. Okay, I've promised to say something about stock volatility. I told you about investing advice. Now, on investing, one thing you should remember is this. Emotions are your enemy. Everyone thinks of themselves as a disciplined, long-term investor until the market tanks. Then it becomes, oh, is it too late? Are we going to lose everything? It's human nature. And so one piece of advice, if you feel good, don't. If you feel bad, do it in investing. Emotions are your enemy. When things go well, you get a little too giddy. When things are bad, you get whipsawed, which gets to this. So saying be disciplined is like saying eat less and you'll lose weight. Oh, very helpful. Thank you very much. Yes, okay. So divide when you're investing, especially young people, as you start to put money together. Even though you think you're going to live forever, you won't. But as we get older, we realize that truism. But so divide it into two parts, your retirement money and your non-retirement money. For your retirement, whether it's a 401k, an IRA, Keogh plan, whatever it is, go for, unless you're really good at investing, go for an index funds, low expenses, look at those expenses, low expenses, and just put the money in, whether you do it annually or quarterly, deduction, twice a month, whatever it is. Just do it and don't look at it. By the time you retire, your portfolio, your retirement money will have done better than the markets because you won't be whipsawed going in and out. Now, for your inner Buffett, where you think you can do it, fine, do it with your non-retirement money. Maybe you have a knack for it. Maybe you don't. And one other thing on that, before I discuss what's happening now, is never get swayed by what you hear at a cocktail party. Psychologists know, and in fact there's a guy named Daniel Kahneman, won a Nobel Prize for the studies he's done on this, is that the pain of a failure or a loss is about 5 to 10 times greater than the pleasure you get from a win in the market. So nobody wants to talk about their failures, or they kind of glide over it as a prelude to a great success. So when you hear at Thanksgiving, say, your idiot brother-in-law talking about how good he's doing in the market, no, he's not telling the truth. Just don't get swayed by it. Because the tendency is you think, God, my neighbor, my brother-in-law, such idiots, they're doing well. I can do better than those dopes can. Don't fall for that. Don't take that cocktail chatter seriously. Okay, what's happening? Why are stocks wobbly right now? This gets to some greater truths. One is, and all of these are easily overcome, which is why the market hasn't tanked the way it did 10 years ago, easily overcome. One is, what's going to happen to the U.S. dollar? Another is, are we going to have a trade war? Are we going to blow up NAFTA, or are we going to just get some good deals and move forward? And the third one is, will the Federal Reserve hurt the economy? Let me get through those. Let's start with the dollar. Monetary policy. Now, I know when I say the words monetary policy, the eyelids get heavy. It is not the most exciting subject in the world. It's bloody boring. So let me just preface this with giving you a travel tip, give you a little reward for what I'm about to do to you. If you ever find yourself in an airplane, in coach, middle seat, on a runway, watching your life pass away, and you want a little bit of elbow room with your seatmates, start talking about monetary policy. They'll cut you a wide berth if they don't drag you off the plane. And by the way, a lot of you here are single. If you're ever on a bad date and want out, start talking about monetary policy. The evening will end early and you'll never see that person again. Very, very seamless way to just solve a problem. No awkwardness. Just start mouthing about M2 and oh my God, got to get away. But it is critical. And the dollar's been weak for a while, for several months. Come up a little bit recently, but it's been weak. The reason the dollar has been weak and wobbly is because the government wants it that way. There's our Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Mnuchin, let the cat out of the bag a week and a half ago. And he said, we want a weak dollar. Why does he want a weak dollar? Because he says he thinks that'll help trade. It'll make our products cheaper, hurt imports, and that'll reduce the trade deficit. That'll make us stronger. He's full of it. Adam Smith just demolished that 240 years ago. Money makes it possible. If you understand this, you're ahead of most central bankers. Money is like a claim check. You know, in wintertime, you check your coat in a restaurant, what do you get? You get a piece of plastic, piece of paper, worthless in and of itself, but a claim on a real product. Or you buy a ticket to an event, whether it's the piece of paper or an ellipse, you can handheld, worthless in and of itself, but a claim on a real service. So it's like a claim check, worthless in and of itself, but because of trust, we take these intrinsically worthless pieces of paper, token coins, or things on our handhelds, and get real products, investments, services in return. Makes buying and selling with each other easier, which is how we make progress. If we couldn't transact with each other, today we do it tens of billions of times a day around the world, we'd still be living in caves. The other thing to remember, money is it's a measure of value. It's a measure of value. Like a scale measures weight, clock measures time, a ruler measures space. Money measures value, which makes it so easy. Instead of barter, imagine if we had barter today trying to deposit a cow into an ATM. And it's just very, very inefficient, very inefficient. So in terms of money, it just makes doing business with each other easier. We do it all the time. Don't think anything of it oftentimes. But if money is changing value, think of it this way. Imagine what your life would be like if the Federal Reserve, our central bank, was in charge of the Time Bureau and decided to float the clock. That is 60 minutes an hour one day, 48 minutes an hour the next day, 50 minutes the day after. You know, life would be chaotic if you couldn't trust the clock. Or imagine, you know, we take for granted that if we buy a gallon of gasoline, it's the same size, same amount today as it was yesterday or the day before or will be tomorrow. Buy a pound of cheese, same thing. It doesn't fluctuate each day. 16 ounces one day, 12 ounces the next, 18 the next. You know, life would be chaotic. The same is true of money. If it's going all over the place, floating all over the place, it makes investment hard because it's not an accurate measure. We saw it back in the 1970s, the last time we indulged in this nonsense. Suddenly oil went from $3 to almost $40 a barrel. People thought we must be running out of this stuff. But it wasn't suddenly oil becoming more valuable, but the dollar was becoming less valuable. We saw it at the early part of the last decade. We started to do this again. Oil suddenly went up from $20, $25 to over $100. Everything went up. Most catastrophically went up in housing. It wasn't that houses were becoming more valuable, but that's what everyone thought, was the dollar was becoming cheaper. We paid a dear price for it. Now these people are mucking around with it again. And this is not a partisan thing, Democrats, Republicans, they don't get it. So leave the dollar alone. Alexander Hamilton understood. Make it stable in value. By golly, you can focus on real things instead of worrying about what they're going to do to interest rates and things like that. And as for trade, the U.S. has had a merchandise trade deficit for most of the time for the last 400 years. It's just one part of it. It ignores the fact that investment money's coming into this country. So it balances out. It's an artifact. When you go to McDonald's, you have a trade deficit with McDonald's. Forbes had a trade deficit with our paper suppliers for over 100 years. They don't buy enough subscriptions to make up for the fact of all the money we spend with these paper supplies. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything. So with that kind of noise, just ignore it. But Mnuchin got people thinking, by golly, even though the dollar hasn't really taken a tank yet, are we going to do what we did in the 70s? Are we going to do what we did 15 years ago and really mess things up? That's the fear. Markets fear things. So an unstable or weak dollar is like a virus in a computer. It corrupts the information, just as it did with oil. Oil wasn't getting more valuable, the dollar was getting weaker, but people thought oil was becoming more valuable, distorted everything. So prices are supposed to give you priceless information, what people want, what people don't want. But if you put the virus in, bad things happen. Bad things happen. So in terms of that, what Mnuchin should do now is vow. He should cut his wrist and say, by the blood of this wrist, we're not going to muck around with the dollar anymore. He hasn't done it yet, but maybe pressure from you will get the administration to do it. Just remember, bottom line on this, I hate to spend so much time on it, but it's one of those things that doesn't get much coverage, but by golly, if you mess up, it has real catastrophic consequences. No country has ever devalued its way to greatness and long-term prosperity, ever. Ask Brazil, ask Argentina, ask Zimbabwe. Look at the Roman Empire when it debauched its currency. What happened there? It never works, yet they keep trying it. Okay, trade. I'm not talking about trade abuses, like China stealing our trade secrets or things like that. But it's one thing to update a trade agreement like NAFTA. You know, half the parts, auto parts covered by the schedules aren't even made anymore. So updating the thing, we didn't have a digital economy 25, 30 years ago. Updating it is fine, and making sure we were getting a fair shake. But it's quite another to blow the thing up. You blow the thing up, it's going to be a disaster. The economy is like an ecosystem, connected in ways people don't even really realize. And when you disrupt that, you pay a price. The biggest example was go back to 1929. Herbert Hoover becomes President of the United States. He notices American agriculture is in distress. So he decides the way to help the farmers was to put a tariff, a tax, on imports of food from places like Canada. Well, by the time Congress got through, they raised taxes on imports for about several thousand items, massive increase in taxes. Other countries retaliated, put their own taxes on, the global trading system was blown up. That began the Great Depression. Then they did other dumb things like raise taxes. One of the things they did in this country was they put taxes on everything, including checks. If you wrote a check in the early 30s, you paid a tax on it. They raised the top income tax rate from 25 to 63% and wondered why the economy continued to go down. Really dumb stuff. But it began with a global trade war. Now, we're not going to have that happen again. I think we will get an updated, revised NAFTA and other trade agreements, but if we let that fall apart, bad things are going to happen. The market will take a hit. The economy will take a hit. Now, the third thing that is worrying the market is our friends at the Federal Reserve, who should just be sent to North Korea and told, stay there. They're now talking about, you won't believe this, after this long period where the economy never really got going, now it's starting to get going, now these people are talking about the economy is maybe overheating. They may have to do something to try to slow it down. It's insane. They believe that prosperity causes inflation. That when people are doing well, the economy, they call it overheat. The economy's not an engine. Overheats. Economy's millions of people in this country, billions of people around the world doing transactions with each other billions of times a day, countless entities around the world doing business with each other. There's always stuff going on. Sometimes an area gets hot, too much money pours in, you have a shakeout, new product comes along, disruptor like Uber, like what the web did to my print business. These things happen, but that's normal. But the idea that you can treat the economy like an engine, I mean, the Fed they don't even know what the future is. Their predictions are always wrong. They're always wrong. And yet they're talking now, maybe they have to do something. Jack up rates very high. They shouldn't even be touching interest rates. Leave it alone. Let these things work out. Now, if you get a panic or something, yes, you become a lender of last resort, but otherwise leave it alone. But they're now telling they have to slow it down. People might be doing too well. You might be earning too much. Salaries might be going up too much. It's insane, absolutely insane. It's not an engine. So in free markets, there are always going to be disruptions. So given the economy itself and given the economies around the world, the market's not overpriced, but the market is worried. Maybe they'll do something dumb on trade. Maybe they'll do something dumb with the dollar. Maybe the Federal Reserve will start believing this overheating nonsense. So those are the three bad things. Now, and by the way, to impress your economics professors, the idea that prosperity causes inflation is called the Phillips curve. It's not a pitch, not a baseball pitch. It's named after an Australian economist who purported to find that if you had more inflation, you had more prosperity. If you wanted to fight inflation, you had to throw people out of work. Experience shows it's nonsense, but the Phillips curve is holy writ inside the Federal Reserve. So just remember that. Phillips curve, bad. Okay, before we get the Q&A, let's hit three big things that are out there. I mentioned the worry about the market is one of them, but there are three other things I want to hit on. One is taxes. Another one is healthcare. Another one is regulation. Let me just hit regulation first. Regulation rules are like taxes. You need some of them, as Madison said, but we've gone overboard in this country. Regulations now cost this economy $2 trillion a year. And to show how crazy it is in terms of rules and regulations, I mean, if you have a mud puddle, till recently, the EPA thought you had the Mississippi River and wanted to treat it as a flood zone or something. Absolutely crazy stuff. In terms of the laws the government now has, there's so many laws they don't even know what it is. If you have a doggy and you have one of those flexible leashes where you can make it long or short depending on what you want to do with the pooch, if you go on federal land owned by the federal government, and your leash is longer than 6 feet, you've committed a federal crime. It's floated with this crazy stuff. So it's good we're finally starting to get rid of it, whether it's in energy and some other areas. Get a little common sense, like the internet. Don't regulate it like it was dial-up telephones. They put that in 2.5 years ago. There was no problem, but they'd hurt investment. Let it alone. Sensible rules. Let the thing flourish. And so the deregulation move overall is pretty good. Now, taxes. The thing to remember about taxes is they just don't raise revenue for government. They're also a price and a burden. Tax you pay on income is the price you pay for working. Tax on profit, the price you pay for being successful. Tax on capital gains, the price you pay for taking risks that work out. The proposition is a very simple one. When you lower the price of good things like productive work, risk-taking success, you'll get more of them. Raise the price, you get less of them. So very basic. Now, what happened with this tax bill? This tax bill they passed, Republicans finally got through, overall does more good than harm. But by golly, they made it awfully difficult. Now, when we look back at people in olden times, we wonder, why did they do seemingly these crazy things? Like the Greeks, very, very great in philosophy and all that kind of thing, but they took very seriously the Delphic oracle. you wanted to do something, go to the Delphic Oracle. There's a lot of steam and, good show. Delphic Oracle would say something that you could be taken any way you wanted. Could show something for pundits today. And the Romans. Romans perhaps having a Las Vegas gene, you had Vestal virgins dancing around while they gave you what was going to happen in the future. It was all nonsense, but we still have that mindset today. In Washington, it's not virgins dancing around or smoke and mirrors with oracles. They worship this thing, especially Republicans, called the Congressional Budget Office. They're supposed to calculate, the Congressional Budget Office, what a change in the tax law or spending law will do 10 years down. Now, if they really could see the future, they would not be working for the Congressional Budget Office. They'd be buying lottery tickets. They would be investing in stocks or commodities. They wouldn't be in the CBO. And their model is nonsense. It assumes taxes don't much affect the economy. Well, experience shows that's not true. This phrase, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, that's their computer model. But the Republicans take it very seriously, which is why they did a lot of dumb things like leading off with health care. Why didn't they do a tax cut before tackling how they learned health care is a very complicated area? Why did they lead off with it? Because they were told that if they reformed Obamacare, they would have $1.1 trillion to cut taxes over the next 10 years. The numbers were all nonsense, but they took it seriously. And so what did that tell normal people? Normal people, in an initial reaction, if you're going to take money away from health care, initial reaction is, you're taking something away from me. By the time the Democrats got through with the Republicans, people thought Aunt Tilly was going to be thrown out on the street, that Obamacare was bad, but maybe these guys are going to do something worse. So they blew the thing, but it was all because of the Congressional Budget Office. Well, finally, they got a tax bill. They did some good things on the business side. Personal side, not so much, because they felt that they couldn't, the CBO said you couldn't do it. They should have just done it. And I hope in a couple of years when they go back to this, they will get it right. The way to get it right is to recognize this. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address defined the character of the American nation in 272 words. The American Constitution and the amendments, a little over 7,000 words. The Bible, which took centuries to put together, 773,000 words. Now the federal income tax code and all the attendant rules and regulations, not just the code itself, but all the attendant rules and regulations, 10 million words and rising. And nobody knows what's in it. The IRS doesn't know. You call their hotline, even if they deign to answer the phone, a third time they give you the wrong answer. Several years ago, Money Magazine did a survey. They took a hypothetical family's finances, gave the numbers to 46 different tax preparers, people considered expert in the field. You know what they got back? 46 different returns, 46 different calculations of what the family owed, thousands of dollars of difference. This from people who make their living at the thing. When you look at this monstrosity, the federal tax brings out the worst in everyone. It's the biggest lobbying machine in Washington, mucking around with the tax code, brings out the worst in us. Oh, can I deduct my dining room table because I did some work there? I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible. And so the only thing to do with this thing is really just to start over and put in something called the flat tax. Just throw the whole code at it. I used to say bury it, but the EPA probably wouldn't allow it because it's so toxic. Just throw the whole thing out and start over. Throw it all out. No more deductions except for adults and for children. You do that, a plan I had, and there are other variations of, a family of four. Their first $52,800 of salary would be free of federal income tax. No tax on savings, no death tax. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. Do the same thing on the business side. They started doing the business side, but they got to go further. And be done with it. 40 countries have done it. Jurisdictions around the world have done it. It works. Make it simple. And everyone would pay less. The economy would boom. Works where it's been tried. And it's not just an economic income issue. It's a moral issue. The IRS estimates we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. 6 billion? 6 billion hours? Experts estimate we spend over $200 billion a year complying with this monstrosity. Now just go back 20 years. Take those tens of billions of hours, literally trillions of dollars, and just imagine for a moment with all that brain power, wasted brain power, had been applied to creating new products, new services, new medical devices, new cures for diseases, how much better off we'd all be. Next time, let's do it. And one thing you can do is start putting pressure on your representatives. Just start over with this thing and throw the CBO out. I mean, even though I'm a conservative, I would support job retraining for the CBO, for the IRS, and everything else, tax lawyers and the like. Let's be done with it and move forward. Let's be done with it and move forward. So on the tax side, let's do it the right way. Deregulation, let's have a little common sense. And on the money side, let's have a stable dollar, a stable dollar. Let me say a few words in closing, though, on health care. Ask yourself, why do we have a health care crisis? People say it's not the quality of health care in this country. Overall, it's the best in the world. Overall, I was just reading about survival rates for breast cancer in this country now. It's 90%. England's about 80%. But people say, well, people like me are getting older. We want more health services, so prices go up, so we have an affordability problem. But then step back and ask yourself a very simple question. Why is demand for health care considered a problem, whereas demand for anything else in this country is seen as an opportunity? People want more apps. A lot of writers glad to help you out. You want more cars or trucks? Detroit and other manufacturers glad to come to your assistance. Everywhere else, demand is seen as a great opportunity. What's with health care? The problem with health care is we don't have real free markets. We have pieces of it, but no real free markets. It's all third party. It's all third party. Government, big insurance companies, big employers, hospitals. Nobody designed this system. It grew up for a variety of reasons. And so no point pointing, oh, you're the villain, you're the villain. No. Understand what the problem is. There's a disconnect between providers and consumers. In this case, between doctors and patients. And so there are no real free markets. So a hospital, for example, knows that its revenue depends on how well it negotiates with insurance companies, how well it negotiates with Medicare and Medicaid or big employers, not with how they satisfy you. And the proof of it is the lousiest motel in America wouldn't dare put you in a room with another guest with a curtain in between. A sick guest. Think of it. It's crazy. Or these robes they give you that look like they've been washed by the Salvation Army 10,000 times. Can't figure out whether you put it forward, sideways, overhead. How do you put these things on? It's because the patient isn't in charge. So all this talk about reforming healthcare has got to have the patient in charge instead of the third parties. It's beginning to happen. Take prices, for example. If you go to a clinic or hospital and you ask in advance what it's going to cost, they give you a very strange look. It means one of two things. Either you're uninsured or you're crazy. What's it to you? Now, anything else, you want to know what's it going to cost me? Just want to know at least a piece of information. Not in healthcare. There's just one little story on this. About a year and a half ago, I was in New Hampshire visiting a fellow there. And he told the story, he's interested in healthcare, told the story he had a heart condition, so he went to the cardiologist, and one of the things the cardiologist said is you should have a nuclear stress test, where they put something in you and tracks the blood or whatever. And so in all innocence, the guy asked the doc, what's it going to cost? Doc says, I don't know. Insurance will cover it. Don't worry about it. This guy, being an entrepreneur and therefore not taking things as they are, goes out and with a group of people, hard work, gets prices from 25 different clinics and hospitals in the New England region. Now, the test is the same everywhere. It's not as if one does it differently than the other. Same everywhere. The prices ranged from $1,450 to $7,300. Same test. So that shows you that shows you what the problem is. So how do we go forward on this? Well, one thing, we should have nationwide shopping for health insurance. Right now, it's all state markets. Open it up. We're supposed to be one country. So have scores of companies compete for your business. Why not? How about taxes? If you're a business, you get a tax deduction. Self-employed, you get a tax deduction. But if you're an individual that wants to buy it on your own, you're paying with after-tax dollars. So equalize that. How about having clinics and hospitals post prices for everything online? See it in advance. This is not very pleasant, but hospitals should also post each month, not just have it buried in health departments on the state level. Each month, how many patients die of infections received after they're admitted to a hospital. Now, we all know when you go in the hospital, you're vulnerable to infections anyway. But about 90,000 people in this country die from infections received after they're admitted to the hospital, and experts estimate at least 70,000 are unnecessary deaths. So transparency would go a long ways. And by the way, a consumer market's beginning to rise up in healthcare. Why? Because your deductibles are going up, your co-pays are going up, so people are becoming more conscious, and entities are starting to rise up to meet the market as if you were a consumer, not third party. Just give you one example. In Oklahoma, there's a hospital called the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, started by a couple of cardiologists a few years ago. They did something radical. No insurance. You pay like you would anywhere else. Credit card, check, whatever. Their prices are so low, and their surgeons are all board certified, so it's not a quality issue. Their prices are so low that the state of Oklahoma now urges state employees for many kinds of surgeries to go to this hospital, because even though it's not covered by insurance, they still save money. That's what consumerism can do in healthcare. We need more of it. And that way, you'll be in charge. They'll be serving you. And you'll see a whole different system. You'll see, like you do in other markets, more for less, more abundance, rather than the rationing you have in England and elsewhere. And just in closing on healthcare, just one little tip, serious one. We all know with cancer, I've had cancer, millions of people have had cancer, the earlier you detect it, the better, most of the time. And with breast cancer, mammograms are supposed to detect it early if something happens. Problem is, if you have dense tissue, traditional mammograms are not very good at detecting cancer in its early stages. Now, they have souped-up versions of mammograms that are supposed to be better, they are. But if you're going to do a mammogram, you have dense tissue, insist, they'll tell you not to do it, but insist on molecular breast imaging, MBI, molecular breast imaging. It is 2 to 3 times better than mammograms. Mayo Clinic, no slouch, has done research on it. But by golly, it's being resisted in a lot of places that shouldn't be resisting it. So insist on it. They'll say, oh, it's going to cost more money. Well, when your life is at stake, a few $100 extra is not going to make that much difference if you want to detect something that can kill you early. So MBI, one little note on that. So in terms of all of this, in terms of an economy, no arrangement is perfect because we are not perfect. But with all the flaws of human beings, free markets, more than any other kind of system, allows people to do well, as Lincoln put it, better their lot in life, and also do it not in a zero-sum way. Disruptive at times, yes. But, and we do live in an era, what we're going through in print, we've made a successful transition, but by golly, it's been difficult. So we do live in an era where if you have responsibilities, as the saying goes, you can eat well or sleep well, but not both. Eating part I don't have a problem with. Sleep part, yeah, there's some sleepless nights. But the overall thing is, it enables people to move forward, make progress, interact with each other, and reduce barriers between societies. Better to trade than to fight. So with that, thank you all very much, and we'll have some Q&A. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. We will begin the question and answer period now. We have two lines, one line behind this microphone stand and one line over there. Please keep your questions to just a question out of respect for everyone else. We want to get through as many questions as possible. After 30 to 45 seconds, if you haven't got to your question, Nick or I will have to pull the microphone so we can get to the next question. And we're going to switch between the two lines. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask it.
And yes, please keep in mind that we are cutting this off at 8:30, so thank you.
Hi, Mr. Forbes. I see you on Fox News all the time.
Thank you.
I just got a
Hope
question.
I don't frighten you, but
Just got a question about the national debt.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas how we can fix our $20 trillion national debt?
yeah, the only way you're going to deal with the debt is not through austerity. The only way you're going to deal it is get this economy revved up the way it should be revved up. For a decade, we've been going 20 miles an hour. Now we're getting it up to 40. I think if we make some of these changes, we can get it up to 60, 70. If the highway patrol isn't looking, maybe 75 or 80. And when you have a vibrant economy, then that's the only way you're ever going to get a balanced budget. You saw that back in the 60s, even when Lyndon Johnson, the president then, was spending globs of money on the Great Society and the disastrous Vietnam War. Because of John Kennedy's tax cuts and other reforms that were made, the U.S. economy was booming, and by the end of the decade, we had a balanced budget. We had a slight surplus. We forgot the lessons in the 70s. Then we made some good things in the 80s. We spent a lot to win the Cold War, but then in the 90s, we were able to have the economy move, and by the late 1990s, we had budget surpluses and we're starting to pay down the national debt. Then we went off the rails again with the dollar, and so hopefully, if we get things right, stable dollar, continue to slash tax rates, be sensible, common sense on regs and the like, this economy, there's a lot of pent-up energy in this economy, will be moving up. The assets of the nation will be moving up, which makes the debt less burdensome. As you know, take a $100,000 debt. If you're making $10,000 a year, you're in trouble. If you're making $300,000 a year, not so much trouble. Bill Gates, no problem at all. So you want the asset side to move up. In the 80s, for example, not to bore you with numbers, when Reagan had his big military buildup in order to win the Cold War, the national debt went up $1.7 trillion. But because the U.S. economy was doing so well, the net wealth of the nation went up $17 trillion. Wages were moving up. People were moving up the economic ladder. But we keep forgetting what works. So hopefully, if we remember what works, and we'll be able to deal with this problem. We'll be able to get the debt first. We have a booming economy, and then you start to get surpluses, and you can start paying it down. And that's the only way, only with a vibrant economy. That's why when they say you can't afford tax cuts, if the tax cuts are done right, mostly cutting rates and simplifying the code, you have to do it, even if the deficit goes up temporarily, because investments don't pay off overnight. You don't build a new factory or new facility overnight. These things take time to rev in, but when they rev in, by golly, as John Kennedy showed, as Reagan showed, by golly, they're very, very powerful. Very powerful. Yeah.
Thank you for that broad, wide-ranging presentation. Perhaps you can take a broad, in an academic setting, hypothetical. If you had it to do over again, young person, in whatever country you're in, born and raised there, educated, enculturated, knew the system, would you have a better chance starting out as an entrepreneur in a country that was under a democratic capitalist system with all of its parliaments and congresses and loggerheads and regulatory burdens and all the negatives, I'm being a devil's advocate there, or in an autocratic capitalism system where top-down command and control, we're going to build the infrastructure and you're one of those entrepreneurs? Example probably would be China these days. Which would you prefer and why?
You'd obviously want the democratic system, because under a democratic system, when you make mistakes, you can correct them. This country sometimes goes off the rails, but when you have a free society, eventually you get it back in the right direction. Whereas if you have an autocratic society, they may get some things right at the beginning, but then they become sclerotic. They become set in their ways, and it's impossible to change. So China looks good. China's formidable. It's amazing what they've done. Absolutely extraordinary. But it won't have the dynamism in the future if they don't open up that economy. It's relatively open, and when you have a capitalist system, eventually, if you don't crush it, it creates the forces where you will get more liberalization. We saw that in South Korea, we saw it in Taiwan, we saw it in Chile, and the autocratic, the response in China today has been there, initially they get harsher because suddenly there's all this ferment. But if you have that relatively open economy, you're going to get a middle class that just is not going to tolerate being told what to do all the time. So there's the ability to correct mistakes that free societies have. And that's what in the marketplace, if a company gets set in its ways, there's always somebody else coming along, usually an outsider, figuring out how to do it differently and better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to hear your opinion on auditing the Fed and whether the government should be involved in that audit.
The Federal Reserve should not only be audited, it should be sharply downsized and a few other things. The Fed was simply created, the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913 as simply a model on the Bank of England, simply to provide the banking system with credit when cash is short. Back in those days, we had a largely agricultural economy, and because of the way workers were paid in those days, there was always going to be a shortage of cash in the fall when the crops were harvested. The laborers were paid. The banking system we had, which we had crazy rules for, you always had a shortage of cash. So the Fed was there to make sure that that didn't happen. And also to keep the dollar fixed to gold, which went back to Alexander Hamilton. And that was it. Not much to do. But then came World War I and the need to finance a great war, and they used inflation and everything else, and we were off to the races. So the Fed should have only one primary role, that is keep the dollar stable. Best way is a gold standard. You don't use gold, it's just like a ruler. Hamilton had it right. The old English system had it right before they forgot it. So a stable dollar, and when we had that system, it was miraculous. There were a lot of things that contributed to our success, but when Hamilton came in, we were a deadbeat nation. We were a junk bond nation. We made Greece look like Germany, and it was terrible. But by putting in a sensible system, within 100 years, we went from a small East Coast subsistence agriculture nation to a globe-girdling continent and the largest economy in the world. Our average growth rate from the time of Hamilton to the 1970s was the highest in human history. And this was despite a civil war, 2 world wars, a lot of political turmoil, a lot of change, disruptions, extraordinary overall record of success. And so we got to get that back. And the idea, again, that any group of people, no matter how smart, can determine what this economy should and should not do is just totally preposterous. And this is why socialism doesn't work. It can't predict the future. You can't predict the future. Nobody predicted Bezos. Nobody predicted Microsoft. Nobody 100 years ago predicted Boeing. These things come and say, where did that come from? Then we take it for granted. It's apps. If you'd said the word apps 12, 15 years ago, app writer, you'd think, well, you fill out applications for people? What are you talking about? So, yeah, they can't predict the future. And by the way, there's now a lot of worry about the FANGs. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and throw in Microsoft and maybe somebody else. But they're taking over the world. They're crushing competition. Well, usually when those stories start about the need to break these things up is usually when they're reaching their peak. And watch out, not for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a high-tech cry for help. It's not money, just going all over the place. It's not money. That's so unstable. Just one little thing on Bitcoin. If you'd, say, 4 years ago, taken a mortgage in Bitcoin, say for $350,000, a month ago you'd owed the bank $49 million. Today it'd be about $25 million. That's not money. That's simply a speculative tool. Steak one day, dog food the next. No, it's not going to work. What is interesting to watch about this is the technology behind it, what they call blockchain. It's about to go in a new phase, which is going to have an enormous impact on this economy, not only in the financial payment system, but also in security. Our system today is like a sieve. It seems like everyone's hacking everything. That's going to change with the advances in blockchain technology. So, and what will that mean for a lot of these companies? Trouble. There's always something new coming along. Microsoft 20 years ago was the big bad thing. Now it's still a formidable company, very profitable today, but nobody thinks Microsoft's taken over the world. Now it's Amazon. And by the way, one other little thing, very good for young people, is how does a large organization stay nimble, which so far Amazon has. How do they do it? They have a great belief in teams, small groups of people working on a project. A lot of research going on the study of teams. And Bezos has a two-pizza rule. Two-pizza rule. The two-pizza rule is if it takes more than 2 pizzas to feed a team working at night, the team is too big. 8 to 10 is the maximum. How you put teams together, a lot of research done on that. It's not just an easy thing. But because of that flexibility he so far has maintained, you look at the cloud. Amazon is dominant in the cloud. No one expected that. But they have that flexibility. So maybe he'll defy the odds. But the bottom line is, one, get the Fed out of the way and let things roll. And monsters today become the weaklings of tomorrow. IBM nearly went bust in 1990, even though a few years before was seen as the big monster of the world. General Motors, when I was growing up, was the big monster of the world. Look what happened to them. Very hard to always stay on top of the game. Very hard. Yeah.
Good evening. Given earlier in your presentation you said that a country manipulating its currency will inevitably ruin the country's economy, given that China has manipulated its currency in an ungodly fashion and to ungodly ends, how will this affect their economy in the future, and will we see negative trade relations or negative trade relations, I guess, again, with the United States, and how will that affect both of our manufacturings?
In terms of China and its currency, the thing about China was from about the mid-90s to the latter part of the last decade, they fixed their currency to the dollar. In other words, they farmed out their currency to the Federal Reserve. And so it was fixed. Hong Kong has fixed their dollar to the US dollar since the early 80s, just for stability purposes. And so China, in terms of their currency, they've tried to keep it within a certain range. The problem with China is not the currency. The problem with China is hacking, stealing our stuff, not allowing companies to have a more open access to their markets like we do here, except in sensitive areas of technology. So and a lot of some of the other games that are played. So those are legitimate issues to take them to task. But in terms of the currency, my feeling is that their success has not come from currency manipulation, unless you think tying the currency to the dollar is manipulative. I have other words for it, but tying it to the dollar. But the challenge is that the real challenge for China is, are they going to have a real open free market system? Because if they do, over time it's going to have political implications. So they can crack down as they're doing now. they're doing really, if you read stories about it, there's a story in the paper today. They now have these eyeglasses that do facial recognition. Parts of China where they have a large Muslim population, they have your spittle to get your DNA, and they follow you and cameras and everything. Really spooky 1984 stuff. That is not an environment over time that's going to be innovative and succeed. Here, they want information about you to sell to you. When a society goes from that to trying to control you, which is what we always have to fight against and guard against, you're going to have a problem. So in China, the best thing we can do on currency is make the dollar what Hamilton had it, best currency in the world, good as gold, as John Kennedy said, and others will want to imitate us. That's what the Brits did. That's what inspired Hamilton. That's what the Brits did. That's what we did. We should do it again. Let them follow us. If they want to attach it to the dollar, great. If they want to devalue their currency, go ahead. It doesn't work. Any more, this is simplistic, any more than saying manipulating a scale. You know, we have an obesity problem in this country. Suck it in. If you change the number of ounces in a pound from 16 to 32, by golly, your weight goes down 50% and the obesity problem's over. No, you'd say that's nonsense. That's what they do with money, in essence. So stop it. Keep it stable so we can have a real measurement. Get the real story. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, talking about being level-headed with investments, making sure you're not going with your emotions and whatnot. So I was wondering why so many people lost their mind over Bitcoin, or there's so much hype around it, especially with the millennial generation like myself. Because even as a millennial, I didn't really understand why people were losing their mind over it.
Well, part of it's human nature. That's why we buy lottery tickets. By the way, you should look at a lottery ticket, especially when you get these hundreds of millions of dollars, as not an investment, but as a ticket to entertainment. Because it's fun to buy the ticket and dream what you're going to do if you win. So it's a form of entertainment. Just consider it that. But when something starts to rise up and people start getting rich, like those twins, remember the movie Social Network years ago about Zuckerberg and the twins and the fight they had over who really created Facebook? Well, the twins recently became billionaires because of what they owned in Bitcoin. They're not billionaires now, and so it's the thing, easy money, and that's why in Vegas they always let you win just enough to keep you coming back. By the way, just as an aside, gambling is like golf. Golf, which is why I've never took it up, because I know my personality become addicted to it. And like a gambling house, golf lets you win just enough, get that great shot, just enough to keep you coming back. Exercise and frustration. Exercise and frustration. Some, like Ben, know how to play it, but most of us, it's frustration. But the bottom line is, on Bitcoin, it is not money. I'm surprised none of these cryptocurrencies have figured out that if they make it stable in value, people will start to use it. In other countries, why do they use the dollar? Because they don't trust their own currency. They'd use Bitcoin in a nanosecond. But the key thing, again, about Bitcoin is the technology, which has nothing to do with the money per se, but the technology, what it's going to do to our way of life, like the web did. That's the real story. With cryptocurrencies, if you buy it, just think of it as like a lottery ticket or playing slots in Vegas. Don't have any illusion. It's an investment. It's entertainment.
Thank you again for coming to speak tonight. It's great to hear these opinions expressed on our campus. I also have a question about cryptocurrency. So I'm wondering, where do you see it heading in the future, given its recent crash, and also how do you see the United States responding?
Two questions, and very interesting. Where do I see cryptocurrencies going? I think that someday soon somebody's going to realize a currency is only a currency if you can use it not just for today, but for long-term contracts like a lease on a car or a mortgage or a bond or something like that, which means it has to be stable. Can't be going, $100 5 years ago and $10 zillion today. No, not going to work. Not going to work. So they have to make it stable. But as for the future, what the government will do, the government will try to get control of it. Remember, money was not invented by government. It was invented by people trying to figure out to make it easier to buy and sell with one another without using barter, whereas what economists call coincidence of trade. You might want Forbes magazine. I might want what you're offering. Well, that barter would work, but that's very rare. And so money makes it easy. I don't have to worry about whether you have something I want, because I can take the money and get what I want with it. So the government's going to try to control. And government always tries to control. For example, there's now a war on cash. Why does government not like cash? Because they don't know what you're doing with it. Whereas with electronics, they can be very precise about what you're doing with it if they want to know. And so they're waging this war on cash. They're saying, well, this will help fight money laundering. Fighting cash, banning cash will make it easier to fight terrorists. No, it won't. The idea that a terrorist, first they want to get rid of the $50 and the $100 bills as part of this. And I just can imagine a terrorist lugging a bag of cash saying, oh, these 20s are so much heavier than Benjamins. I'm going to go get a job at McDonald's. This is just too much. I'm going to give this. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. They've already figured out ways around it. Criminal mind never rests. But they are trying to wage war. And by the way, the country in the world, at least in the developed world, that uses cash more proportionally more than anyone else, because they don't trust anybody, Switzerland. No war on cash there. They don't want you to know about what they're doing. They're going to make sure you don't know. So government will try, to answer your question, they will try to control the cash. They will try to, in fact, one guy, there's now becoming one of the governors of the Fed, probably a proper home for him, wants to put slivers on bills that in effect will identify each bill where it goes, so they know that you had it and this is where you left it off. Talk about freakish control. Warning. Yeah.
All right, so we do have a couple minutes left. This will be the last question of the evening.
Hi, thanks again. I was wondering if there were, or if you saw if there were inconsistencies. You mentioned how important free markets are, and I would totally agree. If there are inconsistencies between a position of having strong, tough borders and how that might limit the free exchange of labor, and having a free market and how that might encourage a free exchange of labor.
What was the first part?
If there's any inconsistency between that and how you can bridge that as a free market-oriented conservative.
Bridge what?
If there's an inconsistency between having a position that is tough on borders or having a solid border and
right.
being a free market-oriented.
The world we live in today, you're going to want control of the border. You want to know who's coming in, and you don't want the wrong people coming in. We learned that in 9/11 if we didn't know it before. And sadly, we're never going to go back to what we had before World War I. Before World War I, it was a rarity to have a passport. You could go anywhere you wanted, whenever you wanted. It was all open. Coming to this country as an immigrant, as long as you weren't sick, had tuberculosis or something, you were in. Now, there are some exceptions. California discriminated against Asians, Chinese and Japanese, but those were the exceptions. And but for the most part around the world, that's why you had massive amounts of immigration in the 1800s. People moving all over the place. But that, we're never going to go back to that. Never going to go back to that. So controlling a border today, it's necessary. And a lot of people come in here illegally through airplanes, not crossing from Mexico. But we need to know, sadly, right now, in the world we live in, we need to know who's here. And it's every country wants to know. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have a sensible immigration system. We need reform there. And by the way, one of the reforms I wish we'd do is if you're playing by the rules, you shouldn't have to wait 20 years to find out whether you're going to get a green card or not. It's crazy a lot of times how bad the immigration service treats people. So we got to make that efficient. So if you play by the rules, you know you're going to get a fair shake and administered quickly, not drawn out. But yeah, borders are going to be controlled, but it doesn't mean keeping people out. It just means you want to keep the wrong people from coming in, and capital flows should be fairly free. It's amazing how bad World War I was, just in closing, in many, many ways. The worst of it was the rise of totalitarian ideologies like communism, fascism, Nazism. And by the way, if you look at the Islamic extremists, we think, oh, that's Quran, extreme. No, there's a large element of Marxism and Nazism in that ideology. That totalitarian virus is still lurking out there today. That really got it, sadly, let out of the bottle with World War I. But one of the things about World War I is before the war, there was amazing free flow of capital and trade. And it wasn't until the 1990s that proportionately we reached the same level of trade in goods and in capital that we had in 1914. Did we finally get back to what we had in 1914? But on the people side, not going to be in my lifetime. Just not going to happen. Well, with that, let me say thank you very much for coming here tonight, and hope you have a prosperous future that gets things right. Thank you.